This video discusses the relationship between the two most important sources of law that we use, rules and precedents. And we'll use a simple example to look at how the relationship between these two types of source operates and how they weave together to form the tapestry of law. Let's start with rules. Rules are the most basic of principles, and they tend to be setting standards, they're forward-looking, and tend to be expressed in a general and universal way. So the Ten Commandments, I guess, is an archetypical example of a set of rules. Thou shalt not, thou shalt whatever. Precedents, on the other hand, are backward-looking, and they're looking at specific examples rather than general operation, and they're looking at how we apply the seemingly simple set of rules in a complex and changing environment. Now, all systems of law, unless they're at the absolute tyranny end of legalism, have some room for application. There are very few legal systems historically where rules are applied without question. There's usually a question of judgment and application. This is where precedent comes in. And precedent provides that detail because rules are general. They don't often have the detail you need to anticipate every set of scenarios going forwards. So what you have over time is a set of precedents that build up, and these precedents explain and apply the general rules that are laid down. Now, in our system of law, rules tend to equate to legislation, and precedents, of course, equate to judge-made law, the precedents of case law. It's not always that definite, though, because sometimes legislation can set down a set of examples of application, and they're a form of precedents. You can't do this particular behaviour, and here are some examples of what that behaviour might be, and those are really forms of precedents. And in the same way, precedents may also attempt to set down general rules of application going forward. Now, those aren't typically a binding part of the law itself, but often judges will attempt to set down principles saying, going forward, these are the ways in which we will apply the law in future. So it's not an automatic equation that rules are always legislation, precedents are always case law, but it's the way it generally falls out. And it is the conversation between those two types of law which makes our law what it is. And this is a relationship which Julia Black calls a regulatory conversation. And that's quite a nice term because it sums up the to and fro, the give and take, and also the fact that conversations can be nice and they can be collaborative, or they can be quite antagonistic. And that really shows how the different forums in which our lawmaking operates. All right, so let's look at a simple example to apply this, to illustrate how rules and principles work, rules and precedents work with each other. Let's look at the bedtime rule. Say a child has a bedtime rule of 7 p.m. You have to be in bed at 7 o'clock. Simple, forward-looking rule. Quantifiable, I mean, let's forget about daylight savings for the moment, but you can tell when it's 7 o'clock, it's time for bed. So it's a great, wonderfully certain rule. But just say there's a need to create an exception to that rule, to maybe not apply it so strictly in every case. Just say grandma's coming to visit, and grandma's arriving at 8 p.m. We know that the kids are going to get up as soon as grandma appears. They've only been in bed an hour. So the parents decide to make an exception to the rule. Because grandma's here, the bedtime rule is now going to be extended, and you're going to be able to wait up to 8 o'clock till grandma arrives, and then hopefully be able to go to bed. All well and good, and what we've actually seen then is an application of the firm general bedtime rule in a way that says, well, we've got one exception. We've got one condition in which the bedtime rule is not going to be applied so strictly. But what happens if later on Uncle Frank turns up? Uncle Frank's coming to visit. Now, the kids love Uncle Frank because he's a bit crazy and he's a lot of fun. But the parents know that Uncle Frank's a bit of a dissolute rascal and a bad influence, so they don't want the kids waiting up for Uncle Frank. And besides, Uncle Frank's not coming to 9 p.m. And that's if Uncle Frank actually bothers to show up when he says he's going to come in any case. So they make another ruling and they say, well, no, you're not going to stay up till 9 p.m. until Uncle Frank arrives. So what is the status of this second decision? Is it a new precedent? Are we setting two precedents on this rule? Number one, the grandma precedent. Number two, the Uncle Frank precedent. Or is this a clarification or a modification on the grandma precedent? And there's lots of different ways in which we can interpret that then. So we could say that the bedtime exception rule only applies to visitors who come at 8 p.m, not to visitors who come at 9 p.m. That makes it work. That makes those two seemingly inconsistent decisions consistent. Or we could say the precedent only applies to grandma, not to anyone else. Conversely, we could say the precedent applies to everyone except for Uncle Frank. That would be another way to make sense of those things. And there are many different ways in which we could start breaking it down. We could say perhaps the precedent is gender-based. Or female, you can weight up for female relatives but not for male relatives. We could look at the combination based on the familial relationship and say if it's a direct a line of direct descent, so a father, grandfather, great-grandfather, great-grandmother, then you can stay up. But for more peripheral relatives, so aunts, uncles and cousins, you can't weight up. So there are lots and lots of different ways. You could look at the different colours of people's eyes or whatever if you want to be really ridiculous about it. But there are lots of different ways in which you can take these two seemingly straightforward decisions and interpret them as a set of precedents or as a single precedent. And it may be, and this is what happens in reality, sometimes is the way you need a clarification through rulemaking. The precedents become so complicated, you've got to go back to the rule and you've got to say, okay, the new rule is this, and these are the conditions on that rule. And that often happens in reality when we make law. So, very simple example, but I think it demonstrates how when you're making law, the complexity of application of principles to the real world soon starts to build complexity on complexity. And it shows how the tapestry of law is woven out of that relationship, where rules are way too simple. We need application, but we also need to make sure that application happens in a way that's consistent with those rules. And there's that constant tension, that constant balance between certainty and uncertainty that happens in lawmaking. So I hope that example was useful to you and shows you how no matter what forum in which you're making rules, whether it be a complicated society-wide legislative process or just something simple like the rules of a game or the rules of a household, complexity starts building extremely quickly. And I guess it also shows you that lawyers can make an argument out of absolutely anything. This is a brief footnote on the last video. A canny student saw this video and said to me, this isn't really how the legal system works, though, is it? Because the lawmakers don't really have the opportunity to override rules at whim. You can't really say, just because grandma's coming, that we're going to upset the bedtime rule just for that. And that's absolutely true. I simplified the example to make the point of how that relationship worked. But I also guess it's worth pointing out that under rule of law, everyone is obliged to follow the law, rulemaker or not. So how do we deal with this? Well, what we generally do is that we allow some wiggle room in the way in which we create our rules. So the bedtime rule wouldn't be bedtime is 7 p.m. We would think about that ahead and we would say, we would have set a rule, there's something like bedtime is 7 p.m. unless there are extenuating circumstances. So we would allow some kind of room for discretion in the way in which we set the rules. Now, obviously that makes the rules a lot less certain and undermines the idea of rules as a certain system of governance, of government, if you start creating this sort of wiggle room in every rule you create, but that's what we do. Another way, of course, that we would could do this is we could say that bedtime is something that's set by parental mandate, and that's something which is flexibly set, and the parents need to, with 24 hours notice, can change what that mandate is. And that approach is pretty much what we do with regulations, and I'll do a video later on how legislation and regulations work together. But again, basically it allows a different way of flexibly changing the rules by publishing a changing set of standards that are set elsewhere. And again, we end up with that problem that outside of the rules and the precedents, the system becomes more uncertain the more you create these spaces for uncertainty. And on top of that, there are developments happening politically now where governments are more and more trying to rely on things like executive orders or royal prerogative powers, which are executive powers which circumvent the entire system altogether. We've seen that even in President Obama's tenure, very widespread use of executive powers. And in Britain, we've seen with the move towards Brexit, the idea of those executive powers being used in a really broad and sweeping way. And as always, we need to be concerned about that. We've seen it in Australia too, with the immigration laws and some of the things that have been done to try and upset the actual way in which the legal system deals with immigration law by political interference through these executive rules, these executive orders. So that's something to keep an eye on. But back to the point, yes, our system is a little bit more complicated than that. You can't just avoid a rule because you want to, but it does make the example a little more complicated because what we do is we build these little bits of wiggle room and these little bits of space in the way in which we set rules ahead of time because we know we're going to use it later on.